The Aryan race, a theory used by the Nazis to push fascist ideas, used by white supremacists to justify racism, and yet still isn't truly understood or properly explained. Today we'll be exploring its origins to get a true understanding of this myth. Also, before we get into the video, please make sure to like and subscribe to support the channel, and also make sure to keep the notifications on so you never miss a video. In The Aryan Myth, the history of racist and nationalist ideas in Europe, Leon Polyakov explained that the chief promoter of the myth of an Aryan race at the beginning of the 19th century was Friedrich Schlegel, who was married to Dorothea Mendelssohn, daughter of Moses Mendelssohn, leader of the Jewish Enlightenment and a purported successor of the false messiah Sabbatai Zevi. Contrary to popular assumption, the outlandish racial theories of the Nazis were not a new development, but rather the entire aspirations of their regime derived from a tradition of German nationalism that dated back to the Romantic era of the early 19th century, which was influenced by the occult legends of Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. Merged with the myth of Atlantis, the notion of Oriental Kabbalah, derived from the Écossaise Freemasonry, had allowed the formulation of the theory that occult doctrines were developed in ancient Asia, primarily Tibet, long before they were appropriated by the Jews. The theory was rooted in attempts to tie the ancestors of the Europeans to the Khazars, and ultimately the lost tribes and Gog and Magog, which contributed to the invention of the myth of the Aryan race. According to Voltaire, for example, the Jews, in quote, stole what was worth in their religion from the Aryans, people whom they called Gog and Magog. The European idea of nationalism is founded on the notion of a single national identity, based on a combination of shared culture, ethnicity, geography, language, politics, religion, traditions, and history. Scholars frequently place the beginning of nationalism with the American Declaration of Independence, or with the French Revolution, for their impact on European intellectuals. The notion of nationalism as a method for mobilizing public opinion around a new state based on popular sovereignty went back to such philosophers such as Rousseau and Voltaire, whose ideas influenced the French Revolution. Much of the 19th century European nationalism arose with Napoleon's rise to power, when he took advantage of his invasion of much of Europe to spread revolutionary ideas. German nationalism after the Congress of Vienna was inspired by the ideals of the Romantic era. Jonathan Gottfried von Herder, a member of the Illuminati, was among those chiefly responsible for the rise of Romantic nationalism, which fundamentally influenced the formulation of the myth of the Aryan race. It was as a result of their influence exercised at the Masonic Congress at Wilhelmsbad of 1782 that the Illuminati came to wield enormous influence in the world of European secret societies. Many influential intellectuals, clergymen, and politicians counted themselves as members of the Illuminati, including Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick, Grand Master of the Order of Strict Observance, and the diplomat Xavier von Zwack, who became the Illuminati's second in command. The Illuminati attracted literary men such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, and Johann Gottfried Herder, the leading exponents of the Romantic movement and Weimar classicism. In their rejection of the Enlightenment and the imperial ambitions of French under Napoleon, they helped shape the growing German nationalism and its attended occult-based theories of race, which exploded with the catastrophic consequences under the Nazis in the 20th century. By advancing the basis of the Lurianic Kabbalah, the Illuminati philosophers were responsible for the development of the idea of progress, a fundamental assumption of Western civilization, where human values and institutions are believed to be an inexplorable path of improvement over time, having begun in Greece and progressed through Rome and finally Europe. The Western idea of progress was mediated from Lurianic Kabbalah by way of Freemasonry. As explained in The Meaning of Masonry by W. L. Wilmshurst, the evolution of man into Superman was always the purpose of the ancient mysteries, and the real purpose of modern Masonry is not the social and charitable purposes to which so much attention is paid, but the expediting of the spiritual evolution of those who aspire to perfect their own nature and transform it into a more godlike quality. And this is a definite science, a royal art, which it is possible for each of us to put into practice, whilst to join the craft for any other purpose than to study and pursue this science is to misunderstand its meaning. Later in the book, Wilmshurst further explains, man who has sprung from earth and developed through the lower kingdoms of nature to his present rational state has yet to complete his evolution by becoming a godlike being and unifying his consciousness with the omniscient, to promote which is and always has been the sole aim and purpose of all initiation. Kant wrote the essay Idea of a Universal History from a Cosmopolitical Point of View. in which the idea of progress of mankind is made central. Marquis de Condorcet, member of the Philalethe's and Bonneville's Circle Social, wrote in Outline of a Historical Picture of Progress of the Human Mind, published after his death, that the history of civilization is one of progress in the sciences, emphasizing the connection between scientific progress and the development of human rights and justice, and outlines the features of a future rational society founded on scientific knowledge. Moses Mendelssohn's closest friend Lessing incorporated Enlightenment ideas of human advancement in The Education of the Human Race. Illuminatus, another admirer of Mendelssohn, in Outlines of a Philosophy of History of Man, presents mankind in a ceaseless process of evolution. It was not until the concept of a nationalism itself was developed by Herder in 1772 in his Treatise on the Origin of Language, stressing the role of a common language, that German nationalism began. This trend began the conception that a nation was not defined by a shared ideology or religion which a citizen could choose of their own free will, but rather by inherited factors such as language, race, ethnicity, culture, and customs, which came to be associated with the Aryan race, supposed ancestors of the German Volk. The racist theories of the Aryan race were due in part to the nationalistic tendencies of the 18th century, which has been indicated by Leon Poliakov in The Aryan Myth. In addition, however, as Ivan Hannaford has pointed out in Race, the History of an Idea in the West, these theories were also influenced by the pseudo-scientific tendencies derived from the occult, and paradoxically ultimately from the Jewish Kabbalah, where Christianity preached that virtue was measured by piety and good works. Through the influence of Kabbalistic practices such as astrology and physiognomy, a person's virtue came to be associated with the physical characteristics and, most importantly, race. Despite its anti-Semitic associations, the myth of the Aryan race is borrowed from the Jewish Kabbalah. As explained by Charles Novak in his History of Jacob Frank, the Frankist conception of the unfolding of history, following the Sabbatian concept of defeating evil from within, conforms to a perception that one of the secrets of the Bible is that its true history reads in reverse. The banished are the true heroes, and the false heroes are the banished of future times. It goes without saying, therefore, that the Frankist ideal anti-Talmudist fights for the rehabilitation of Esau at the expense of Jacob, and this rehabilitation is part of an even wider field, for it concerns Leah and Rachel, Melchizedek, Hagar, banished by Sarah, and above all Ishmael, the ancestor of Islam, expelled in favor of Isaac, son of Sarah, and finally the supreme extrapolation, the serpent, Samael, and Lilith expelled from paradise, then opposing Adam and Eve, and in this case, I come back to the redemption of evil that will be forgiven one day. When the Frankists were chastised by the rest of the Jewish community, they were denounced as remnants of the mixed multitude, Erev Rav, mentioned in Exodus. Jewish tradition interpreted the phrase Erev Rav as referring to a group of foreigners who joined the Israelites who followed Moses out of Egypt. The majority of rabbinic scholars saw in the mixed multitude the source of corruption. The Erev Rav were to have enticed the Israelites to worship the golden calf and angered God by demanding the abolition of the prohibition of incest. As recounted in the Zohar, the Erev Rav were the impurity that the serpent imparted to Eve. They were offspring of the demonic rulers, Samael and Lilith. They were the Nephilim, or, in quote, sons of God, who intermarried with the female descendants of Cain prior to the flood. They practiced incest, idolatry, and witchcraft. They contributed to the building of the Tower of Babel and caused the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. They were the cause of the imprisonment of the divine presence in the demonic realm of the husks and the exile of Israel among the nations. According to the Zohar, it is them, the mixed multitude, who caused the world to revert to the state of waste and void. The mystery of this matter is that because of them, the temple was destroyed, and the earth was waste and void. For the temple is the center and foundation of the world. Yet as soon as the light, which is the Holy One, blessed be He, comes, they will be wiped off the face of the earth and will perish. However, occultists were rarely aware of the true history of the Kabbalah, and instead subscribed to the legend that the Kabbalah originated with Solomon, or before him with Moses, and dated as far back as the book of Genesis. Essentially, the Kabbalah teaches that its secrets were imparted to humanity before the flood by a race of beings referred to in the Bible as, in quote, the sons of God, recognized in esoteric literature as the fallen angels, or the devil and his legions, who were cast out of heaven. The sons of God intermarried with the descendants of Cain, one of the two sons of Adam and Eve, who had been cursed for killing his brother Abel, giving birth to a race of giants, to whom they taught the knowledge they had stolen in their descent from heaven. As occultists are Gnostics, they reverse their interpretation of the Bible and reject orthodox interpretations. They therefore rejected the idea of the Jews being the originators of the Kabbalah, which they preferred to attribute to the descendants of Cain, whom they equated as the ancestors of the Europeans. Though Renaissance scholars had tended to regard Egypt as the fount of the ancient wisdom, colonization opened India to the west, and many Upanishads and other Vedic literature became available, and therefore in a desire to discover in the ancient Orient a rival society to that of the Hebrew, scholars of the Enlightenment turned to that region of the world as the possible origin of all occult knowledge, ultimately recognizing the presence of doctrines similar to those sacred to the occult tradition among the traditions of the ancient Egyptians, Indians, Greeks, and Celts. European occultists falsely presumed the occult to represent the vestiges of the ancient wisdom. Such a theory thereby provided the basis to build the myth of the history of Western civilization, where ancient Greek society incepted a process of intellectual evolution that led away from the belief in God and culminated in the secularism of the Enlightenment and beyond. Growing interest in India stimulated further linguistics inquiries, pioneered by Frenchman Anquetil Duperron, an English philologist and Freemason Sir William Jones, who both showed an interest in the Cochin Jews of the Malabar coast of India. In 1771, Duperron completed the translation of the Zend Avesta, the scriptures of the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. Finally, the mysteries of the ancient Indian language of Sanskrit were revealed. About 1780, the Brahmins and Bengal were given orders to translate into English the ancient laws and sacred writings of India. In 1783, William Jones was appointed Justice of the High Court of Bengal. He set himself to study Sanskrit and soon recognized certain similarities with Greek, Latin, Celtic, and Germanic languages. Later, Franz Bopp showed that Avestan, Armenian, and Slavic languages were also related. These hypotheses were somewhat disputed, but eventually approved by most Orientalists. For convenience, these languages were referred to as Indo-German by most German authors, while other countries preferred to use the term Indo-European. Though initially asserted as merely a linguistic relationship, it was eventually theorized that if there had once existed an original Indo-European language, there must also have been an original Indo-European race. As Robert Drews summarizes, it is an unfortunate coincidence that the studies of the Indo-European language community flourished at a time when nationalism and a tendency to see history in racial terms was on the rise in Europe. There was no blinking the fact in the 19th century that most of the world was dominated by Europeans or people of European descent. The easiest explanation for this was that Europeans, or at least most members of the European family, were genetically superior to peoples of dark complexion. It was thus a welcome discovery that the ancient Greeks and Persians were linguistically, and therefore one could assume biologically, related to the modern Europeans. The same racial stock, it appeared, had been in control of the world since Cyrus conquered Babylon. This stock was obviously the white race. India, it is true, presented a problem and required a separate explanation. Aryans had invaded India no later than the 2nd millennium BC and successfully imposed their language on the aboriginal population. But the Aryan race had evidently become sterile in that southern clime and was eventually submerged by the aboriginal and inferior stock of the subcontinent. Following Gnostic tradition, the scholars of the Enlightenment and Romantic period apparently imparted a positive interpretation to the sons of God. Thus, borrowing from the biblical story of the sons of God as well as the legends of Atlantis, these scholars proposed that the Aryans survived the flood and landed in the Caucasus in southern Russia, the original location of the Scythians, from where they spread out to conquer the known parts of the world, bringing with them their occult knowledge everywhere they went, including in particular Persia, India, and Europe. In 1779, John Sylvian Bailey, a member of the Illuminati-connected Masonic lodge called Neuf Soirs in Paris, in his Histoire de l'astronomie ancienne developed a theory of migrating races, which he based on certain recurrent errors in astronomical tables brought back by missionaries from India. Errors, he maintained, which could not have been drawn up from observations made in India, but only in Central Asia. Bailey concluded that Atlantis was Spitsbergen in the Arctic Ocean, which in ancient times had a warm climate, but its subsequent cooling made the Atlanteans migrate south to Mongolia. Later, this race of giants dwelt in the Caucasus and laid the foundations for all the ancient civilizations of Asia. In 1803, Bory de St. Vincent published his Essays on the Fortune Islands and Ancient Atlantis, in which he set forth the conventional Atlantis story. St. Vincent assumed that Atlantis was the original home of civilization, and that when subjected to a cataclysm, its inhabitants were forced to conquer the known world in search of new territories. In 1805, Francis Wilford advanced a hypothesis according to which, in order to account for the occult teachings of the Celtic Druids, the British Isles must have been a remnant of a former Atlantic continent, where the events of the Old Testament had actually taken place. Voltaire strove to demonstrate that Adam had taken over everything, even his name from the Indians. He considered that all occult knowledge was ultimately of Indian origin. In quote, "I am convinced that everything has come down to us from the banks of the Ganges, astronomy, astrology, metempsychosis, etc." The Encyclopedia of Diderot in the article on India suggested that the sciences may be more ancient in India than in Egypt. Kant placed the origin of mankind in Tibet because, in quote, "This is the highest country, no doubt it was inhabited before any other and could have even been the site of all creation and all science. The culture of the Indians, as is known, almost certainly came from Tibet, just as all our arts like agriculture, numbers, the game of chess, etc. seem to have come from India." Friedrich von Schlegel supposed that, as a result of mingling, a new people had formed itself in northern India, and that these people, motivated, in quote, by some impulse higher than the spur of necessity, had swarmed towards the west. Wishing to trace the origin of this people back to Cain, he then theorizes, in quote, "Must not this unknown anxiety of which I speak have pursued fugitive man, as it is told of the first murderer whom the Lord marked with a bloody sign, and have flung him to the ends of the earth?" To Schlegel, in quote, "Everything, absolutely everything, is of Indian origin." He carried this conviction a step further, suggesting that even the Egyptians were educated by Indian missionaries. In turn, Egyptians founded a colony in Judea, though the Jews were only partially indoctrinated with the Indian truths, since they seem to have been ignorant of a significant doctrine of the occult tradition, the theory of reincarnation, and especially of the immortality of the soul. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like and subscribe, or dislike if you dislike it. Make sure to press the bell notification button so you never miss another video. Please also be sure to check out the website link in the description below to see all the sources for this video. Until next time, stay safe and stay knowing.